In the quiet town of Port Coquitlam, a pig farmer named Robert Willie Pickton lived a life that seemed ordinary, until dozens of women began to vanish without a trace. Among them were Sarah DeVries, Mona Wilson, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Papin, Andrea Josbury, and Serena Abbotsway, all connected by one chilling thread: the road that led to Pickton's pig farm. As Detective Lori Shenher and her team dug deeper, they uncovered a nightmare hidden beneath the mud and stench of the property. What seemed like a simple farm concealed one of the darkest secrets in Canadian history: a slaughterhouse of unimaginable horror. In the quiet outskirts of Port Coquitlam, a small town in British Columbia, there stood a lonely pig farm that blended into the gray mist of the countryside. The place didn't look special: muddy driveways, broken fences, and the constant noise of squealing pigs. But this land belonged to a man who would become one of the most feared names in Canadian history: Robert Willie Pickton. To the locals, Robert was just another odd farmer. He wore the same dirty overalls every day, drove an old truck that coughed out black smoke, and spoke with a slow, uneasy tone. His face carried an awkward smile, the kind that made people unsure whether to wave back or walk away. He and his brother, David, had inherited the pig farm from their family. It was their world, smelling of blood, feed, and damp soil. But what no one realized was that beneath this simple farmland, a darkness was quietly growing. Robert's farm wasn't just for pigs. Over time, it turned into a strange gathering place. He hosted parties inside his barns, loud, wild events where drugs, alcohol, and chaos mixed freely. People from Vancouver's downtown Eastside often came looking for food, money, or just a place to escape their lives for a while. Robert didn't ask questions. He offered drinks, sometimes cash, and often meat from his pigs, wrapped neatly in plastic. The neighborhood saw him as generous, even friendly. They never thought to question where that meat really came from, or why so many people who visited his farm never returned. In the nearby city, women were disappearing one after another. They were often from rough backgrounds, struggling with poverty, addiction, or homelessness. Many worked in the streets, trying to survive another night. When they went missing, their cases were barely noticed. Their names faded quickly from police reports, filed under unresolved. To the public, these women were invisible, but to Robert Pickton, they were easy targets. The police received reports, tips, and even anonymous calls connecting the disappearances to the pig farm, but nothing solid ever came from them. Officers visited the property a few times, looked around, and left without digging deeper. The smell of decay was blamed on the pigs, the trash, or the slaughterhouse work that Robert sometimes did on the side. Everyone assumed it was just part of farm life, yet there were things that didn't feel right. Some neighbors mentioned hearing strange noises late at night, metal clanging, machines running long after midnight, and sometimes the muffled sounds of screaming. Others noticed how certain visitors came once and were never seen again. Still, no one dared to confront him. He was just that weird pig guy who kept to himself. For years, the pig farm stood as an ordinary place, hiding an extraordinary evil. No one could imagine that within those fences lay the remains of dozens of missing women. No one guessed that Robert Pickton was keeping trophies of his victims, burying their secrets beneath the very soil his pigs walked on. By the late 1990s, the number of missing women in Vancouver's downtown Eastside had reached a level that could no longer be ignored. Mothers waited by phones that never rang. Friends searched the alleys, shelters, and street corners, hoping to find a familiar face. But one by one, the women vanished, leaving behind only silence. Their disappearances were often dismissed as routine. The police believed they had simply moved away, started new lives, or fallen victim to drugs. But to those who knew them, something felt terribly wrong. Among the growing list of names were women who shared striking similarities. They all lived in the same rough neighborhoods, walked the same dimly lit streets, and often knew each other. They were part of a forgotten community, one that existed on the edge of society, where danger was a daily companion. When the first few went missing, no one connected the dots. But as months turned into years, The pattern began to form like a shadow stretching across the city. In the bars and shelters, whispers started spreading about a strange place on the outskirts of town. A pig farm owned by a man who threw wild parties. Some said he offered rides to women in the middle of the night, promising money or food. Others said he was kind, even helpful. Yet the stories always ended the same way. The woman who went with him never came back. Those who mentioned the rumors were often brushed aside. After all, it was only gossip, and the man being talked about was just a farmer. Still, a few detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Among them were officers who had spent years following dead-end leads, piecing together scraps of information from frightened witnesses. They gathered photos, names, and missing persons reports, searching for any overlap. Slowly they began to notice the connection. Nearly all of the missing had some link, however small, to Robert Pickton's pig farm in Port Coquitlam. Despite growing suspicion, progress was painfully slow. The evidence was thin, and the farm was private property. Without solid proof, the police couldn't conduct a full search. Some officers pushed for it anyway, but their requests were delayed, buried under paperwork, or ignored. The missing women were not considered a priority case. Many believed the victims' lifestyles made them unreliable or unimportant. This lack of urgency would later haunt the entire investigation. Meanwhile, Robert Pickton continued his routine, living in plain sight. He drove into the city often, visiting the same streets where the women had vanished. He talked to people, smiled, and returned to his farm with no one questioning where he went or why. Then, everything began to shift after one small event. A worker on Pickton's farm reported finding personal belongings that didn't belong there. The items looked suspicious, too clean, and too personal to be random. The report eventually reached the police. It was the small spark that would ignite one of the darkest investigations in Canadian history. In February 2002, the long trail of missing women finally led police to the farm in Port Coquitlam. What began as a simple search for illegal firearms quickly turned into something far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. When officers stepped onto the muddy property, they were met with the heavy stench of decay that clung to everything: the walls, the barns, and the very soil beneath their boots. Pigs roamed freely among rusted vehicles, piles of garbage, and broken machinery. To the untrained eye, it looked like a neglected farm, but to investigators, something felt disturbingly wrong. Inside the cluttered barns and trailers, police found items that immediately raised suspicion: women's clothing, purses, and identification cards scattered among tools and pig feed. Some objects were stained, others partially buried under heaps of dirt and trash. The deeper they searched, the more unsettling the discoveries became. Forensic teams were called in, and soon the pig farm was transformed into one of the largest crime scenes in Canadian history. Excavation began slowly, methodically. Every inch of the property had to be searched. What they uncovered shocked even the most experienced officers. Beneath the layers of soil, mixed with animal remains, were human bones. Some were fragmented beyond recognition, others hidden inside buckets or feed containers. Detectives realized they were not dealing with a few isolated crimes, but something far larger, something monstrous. Over the next months, the investigation grew into a massive operation involving hundreds of officers and forensic experts. Specialized teams sifted through thousands of cubic meters of earth, carefully separating pig bones from human remains. It was grueling, heartbreaking work. Evidence came in waves: bits of jawbones, fragments of teeth, and small items of jewelry that belonged to women long listed as missing. Each discovery added another piece to the grim puzzle. As the evidence mounted, so did the horror. It became clear that Robert Pickton had been killing women for years, using his farm as both a hunting ground and a dumping site. Some reports suggested he had used farm equipment to dispose of remains, blending them with animal waste to hide his crimes. There were even rumors that human remains might have been processed with pig meat, though these claims were too gruesome to ever be proven completely. The investigation stretched on for years, consuming millions of dollars and countless hours. Families of the missing women gathered outside courtrooms, desperate for answers, clinging to hope that at least some part of their loved ones could be recovered. The police found more evidence linking Pickton directly to multiple victims, including personal items kept as trophies inside his home. By the end of the search, investigators had collected over 200,000 DNA samples from the property. The scale of the crime was beyond comprehension. The pig farm, once a quiet corner of rural Canada, had become a symbol of unimaginable horror, and at the center of it all stood one man, Robert Pickton, whose unassuming life had hidden a darkness no one could have foreseen. When the full extent of what had been discovered on the pig farm became clear, Robert Pickton was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The public could barely grasp the scale of the crimes. News spread rapidly across Canada and beyond, painting a picture of evil that seemed almost impossible to believe. The quiet, awkward farmer with a sloppy grin was now being called one of the worst serial killers the country had ever seen. The case drew massive media attention, and every new detail made it harder to comprehend how something so horrifying could have gone unnoticed for so long. The trial began in 2006, after years of investigation and preparation. It was one of the most complex and expensive trials in Canadian history. The courtroom was filled with journalists, families of the victims, and citizens seeking answers. Prosecutors laid out their case piece by piece, presenting the overwhelming evidence recovered from the farm. Forensic experts testified about the hundreds of DNA samples, blood traces, and personal belongings that tied Pickton to dozens of missing women. The evidence was grim, the photographs unbearable. Even the most hardened professionals struggled to describe what they had seen on that property. During the trial, the defense tried to portray Pickton as a simple man of limited intelligence, suggesting that others might have been involved or that the evidence was contaminated. But the sheer volume of proof was impossible to ignore. The prosecution revealed disturbing statements Pickton had made to undercover officers after his arrest, including his boast that he had killed 49 women and wanted to make it an even 50. Those words froze the courtroom in silence. For the families sitting in the audience, it was a moment of unbearable pain. Each day of testimony uncovered new horrors. Witnesses described the atmosphere of the farm, the strange parties, and the constant stream of vulnerable women who came and went. Forensic specialists explained how they had painstakingly separated human remains from animal bones and how each fragment told a part of a forgotten story. The evidence revealed a pattern of cruelty that was cold and methodical. Pickton had kept trophies, items belonging to his victims, as if they were souvenirs of his crimes. After months of testimony and arguments, the jury reached its verdict in 2007. Robert Pickton was found guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. The charges for the remaining victims were stayed, as the court believed the existing convictions were enough to ensure he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The families were torn between relief and heartbreak. They finally had justice, but not closure. Many questions remained unanswered, and many victims were never identified. Pickton was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence allowed under Canadian law. Yet for many, the punishment felt too small compared to the magnitude of the suffering he caused. The trial had revealed not only one man's cruelty, but also the failure of a system that had ignored so many missing women for far too long. After the trial ended and the verdict was read, a heavy silence settled over Port Coquitlam. The town that had once looked ordinary now carried a name that would forever be linked to horror. The pig farm, once full of life and noise, became a ghostly reminder of everything that had happened there. Police and forensic teams continued to work on the property for months, gathering the last bits of evidence and carefully cataloging every piece of debris. When their work was finally done, the farm was demolished. Every structure, every fence, and every inch of soil was turned over and tested. It was as if the land itself needed to be erased to make peace with what had occurred. But erasing the farm could not erase the pain. Families of the victims continued to struggle with grief and unanswered questions. Many had waited years just to hear the truth about what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. For some, the remains of their loved ones were never found, leaving them trapped in an endless cycle of mourning. Candlelight vigils were held in Vancouver's downtown Eastside, where the women had once lived and worked. Photos of the missing were placed along the sidewalks, surrounded by flowers, candles, and quiet tears. The case forced Canada to face its own failures. Investigations revealed that the warnings about the missing women had been ignored for years. Police had received multiple tips linking Pickton to the disappearances, but failed to act decisively. The victims, most of whom were poor and struggling with addiction, had been overlooked by a system that didn't take their disappearances seriously. Public outrage grew as these truths came to light, leading to protests and demands for accountability. In response, a national inquiry was launched to examine how law enforcement had handled the cases. The inquiry exposed a pattern of neglect, discrimination, and lack of urgency when dealing with vulnerable communities. It became clear that the women who went missing had not only been victims of one man's brutality, but also of society's indifference. The case became a turning point in Canadian history, pushing for reforms in how missing persons cases are investigated, especially when the victims come from marginalized backgrounds. Robert Pickton remained behind bars, serving his life sentence in a high-security prison. He never showed remorse and rarely spoke about his crimes. For the public, he became the face of evil, an ordinary man who had hidden monstrous acts behind a mask of simplicity. Books, documentaries, and films were made about the case, each trying to understand how such darkness could exist undetected for so long. Years later, the land where the pig farm once stood was redeveloped. Grass and trees grew over the ground, and nature slowly reclaimed the space. Yet even as the place transformed, its memory could not be erased. To this day, the story of Robert Pickton stands as one of the darkest chapters in Canada's history, a reminder that monsters do not always look like monsters, and that evil often hides behind ordinary faces and quiet smiles. The story of Robert Willie Pickton remains one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters in Canadian history. What began as quiet disappearances from Vancouver's downtown Eastside uncovered a nightmare buried beneath a farm that looked ordinary in every way. It exposed not only the evil of one man, but also the deep flaws within a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The women whose lives were taken, Sarah DeVries, Mona Wilson, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Papin, Andrea Josbury, and Serena Abotswe, are remembered as more than victims. They are a reminder that justice delayed can silence countless voices. Their stories continue to echo through every courtroom, every news report, and every person who still seeks answers. Though the pig farm has vanished, its memory endures, warning the world that true monsters often hide behind the faces we least suspect. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life true crime documentaries that reveal the darkest secrets behind ordinary lives. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Because every story deserves to be told, and every voice deserves to be heard. Stay curious, stay alert, and remember, sometimes the truth is far more terrifying than fiction.